Welcome to the Urban Herald's Deep Dive series. This is where we, as a team, really try to unpack the complex issues you want to understand better.
hmm
And today, we're tackling, well, one of the most challenging and, frankly, tragic conflicts of our time, the history of the dispute between Israelis and Palestinians.
Yeah, it's a tough one. We undertook a pretty comprehensive historical analysis for you, and it feels especially urgent right now, doesn't it? In 2025, witnessing this just devastating humanitarian crisis in Gaza.
Absolutely devastating.
Mm.
Our report highlights some stark figures: over 470,000 people facing starvation, nearly the entire population displaced, often multiple times. It's hard to even
It
comprehend.
really is. And the current situation, ignited by that horrific Hamas attack on October 7th, 2023, and then Israel's subsequent military operation,
Yeah.
it's a truly catastrophic chapter.
But as our team's analysis makes really clear, this isn't something that just appeared out of nowhere.
Yeah.
Not at all. It's the latest, maybe the most brutal manifestation of a conflict with roots stretching back well over a century. Our research really digs into that long history.
Exactly. So our mission here in this deep dive is to walk you through that history. We've basically distilled our extensive research into this analysis to help you grasp the competing narratives, the pivotal moments, the fundamental issues that have fueled this for generations.
It's incredibly complex and, yeah, heartbreaking. Our goal in presenting this is to lay out the history as objectively as we can, based solely on the research we conducted as the Urban Herald team.
Right. Sticking to what the analysis uncovered.
Precisely. So let's maybe start by unpacking what our analysis found about the very nature of this conflict. What is it, fundamentally?
Okay. So at its core, what does the Urban Herald's report actually say this dispute is about?
Well, we define it fundamentally as a prolonged territorial and political fight. It's over land, over sovereignty, national rights, all within that region historically known as Palestine.
The land between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea.
Exactly, and the central issue we identified is pretty straightforward but incredibly difficult. Both Israelis and Palestinians assert competing claims to the same piece of territory.
And those claims are deep-rooted, aren't they? Historical, religious, political connections.
Deeply rooted, and our analysis breaks down the tangible issues that are still on the table today, the things that keep coming up.
Right, the unresolved questions. You see them in every failed peace talk, every new outbreak of violence. Things like borders, the status of Jerusalem.
The fate of Palestinian refugees, Israel's security concerns, and of course that big question about the possibility, maybe the increasingly distant possibility, of two separate states living side by side.
These aren't just talking points, are they? Our report positions them as the specific fundamental disagreements.
That's right. They're the core sticking points where negotiation after negotiation has just, well, failed to find common ground.
And to really get those, our research shows we need to go back. Way back. The land itself has this immense historical significance, doesn't it? Millennia deep for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam.
Yeah, we touch on that deep history. The ancient claims Israelites having kingdoms around 1000 BCE, the Philistines, where the name Palestine comes from.
But it's crucial, as our report emphasizes, that those ancient ties, while part of the story,
They don't, in themselves, determine who gets sovereignty today, right? Ancient claims alone aren't a legal deed in the modern world. What really stands out from that deep history, as we documented, is the profound religious importance, especially Jerusalem.
right, our analysis really zooms in on Jerusalem's unique status. It's not just about national claims, it's holy ground.
For all three major monotheistic faiths, which is pretty unique, you've got the Western Wall and the Temple Mount site for Judaism, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre for Christianity, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and Dome of the Rock for Islam, all packed into one small area.
And that's where the religious significance crashes right into the national aspirations.
Exactly. Israelis claim Jerusalem as their eternal and undivided capital. Palestinians claim East Jerusalem as the capital of their future state.
And that specific spot, the Temple Mount, or Haram al-Sharif to Muslims, our report identifies that as a major recurring flashpoint.
A huge flashpoint, because it holds such immense sacred meaning for both Jews and Muslims, occupying the same physical space.
Our research also flags the international legal angle here. East Jerusalem is generally considered occupied Palestinian territory under the Fourth Geneva Convention.
Right, though Israel disputes that designation. That legal disagreement just adds another layer of complexity to the whole Jerusalem question.
Okay, stepping back a bit chronologically, our analysis looked at the long period before modern political Zionism really took shape. when the Ottoman Empire ruled the region.
Yeah, for over 400 years. And the demographic picture we found for that era, say the late 19th century, before things really started
It
shifting.
was predominantly Arab, right? A mix of Muslims and Christians.
Correct. Living alongside smaller but continuous Jewish communities who had been there for centuries. We cite estimates, acknowledging historians debate the exact figures, but roughly 85% Arab, maybe 15% Jewish around then.
And our report characterizes that period as, well, relatively stable coexistence, despite other challenges, like economic ones.
Generally, yes, compared to what came later. So you have this region, deep history, specific demographics, and then, as our analysis details, things start to change rapidly with the rise of two powerful, modern nationalist movements.
Right, emerging almost in parallel. In the late 19th century, political Zionism gets going.
Driven partly, our research notes, by rising anti-Semitism in Europe. The goal becomes establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. We mentioned Theodor Herzl, the first Zionist Congress in 1897, key moments.
And this leads to actual Jewish immigration, the Aliyah, starting in the 1880s.
Yes, and our report notes this sometimes involved land purchases. Legal transactions, sure, but they occasionally led to Arab tenant farmers being displaced. Early friction points.
And at the same time, or shortly after, Arab nationalism is developing across the region, and specifically, a distinct Palestinian national consciousness starts to form.
Our research shows that was influenced by several things. The growing Zionist settlement, yes, but also British policies later on, and these broader Arab independence movements.
And this is where we see Arab opposition to the Zionist project really begin to solidify.
Definitely. And then history takes this truly decisive turn during the British Mandate period. That's 1917 to 1948. Our analysis singles out the Balfour Declaration of 1917 as absolutely critical.
Pivotal, yeah. Britain publicly supports establishing a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine.
But, and this is a huge but that our report stresses, the declaration also said nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities.
So inherent tension right there in the wording.
Massive tension. And our research found evidence suggesting this ambiguity, national home, not state, no defined borders, was deliberate.
Why? What did that achieve?
Well, the analysis argues it basically allowed Britain to promise different things to different groups, fueling conflicting interpretations and expectations right from the start. Both Jews and Arabs heard what they wanted to hear, to some extent.
Okay. So the British Mandate Administration gets set up around 1920, and it formally includes this Balfour Declaration. And then, our report details, Jewish immigration really ramps up.
Especially in the 1930s, tragically driven by Jews fleeing Nazi persecution in Europe. This rapid demographic change is a key factor we identified.
What kind of numbers are we talking about?
The Jewish population jumped from maybe 85,000 in 1922 to over 400,000 by 1936. A huge shift in a short time.
And our analysis connects that directly to intensifying Arab opposition and increasing violence.
Absolutely. Our report discusses major Arab uprisings during the Mandate. We cite the 1929 Hebron massacre and especially the sustained Arab revolt from 1936 to 1939.
That was serious, wasn't it? Started as a general strike but became guerrilla warfare.
Yes, it required a major British military effort to suppress. Thousands were killed. It showed the depth of the opposition.
And the British response added more complexity. Our analysis mentions things like the White Papers, trying to limit Jewish immigration.
Right, particularly the 1939 White Paper. It severely restricted Jewish immigration right when the Holocaust was unfolding, and the need for refuge was most desperate. This created huge tensions with the Jewish community who felt betrayed.
So all this pressure, demographic shifts, violence, conflicting promises, British policies, it's all building towards another critical point, the 1948 war.
A massive turning point. Our research explains the lead-up, starting with the UN Partition Plan in late 1947, Resolution 181.
The UN proposes dividing Palestine into two states, one Jewish, one Arab.
Correct. And our analysis points out the proposed land allocation, about 56% for the Jewish state, even though Jews were still only about a third of the population. We note the Jewish leadership accepted this plan, albeit perhaps reluctantly by some.
But the Arab states and Palestinian leaders rejected it.
They rejected it outright, viewing it as fundamentally unfair, giving away too much of their homeland.
And our report shows that rejection immediately sparks intense violence within Palestine between the communities. Then, May 14th, 1948.
Jewish leaders declare the state of Israel.
And the very next day.
Armies from neighboring Arab states invade. The first Arab-Israeli war begins.
Our analysis details the outcome. Israel wins militarily. and they expand their control beyond the UN lines.
Significantly beyond. They end up holding about 78% of former Mandate Palestine. Jordan occupies the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and Egypt controls the Gaza Strip.
For Palestinians, though, this period is known by a different name.
The Nakba, meaning catastrophe, as our report explains. It involved the mass displacement of Palestinians from their homes.
How many people are we talking about?
Our research cites the widely accepted figure of approximately 750,000 Palestinians. They were displaced through various means: direct military actions, psychological warfare, fear, families fleeing the fighting. It's complex and contested, but the result was mass dispossession.
And our analysis highlights that this event created the Palestinian refugee problem, which is still completely unresolved today.
Absolutely. Palestinians assert a right of return to their original homes and lands, based partly on UN Resolution 194. Israel has consistently opposed any mass return, citing security risks and the potential demographic impact on Israel as a Jewish state. It remains one of the absolute core issues.
So 1948 reshapes the map and creates the refugee crisis. Then our analysis identifies the next huge shift, the 1967 Six-Day War. You said this changed everything that followed. How so?
It fundamentally altered the physical reality of the conflict. Israel captured the West Bank from Jordan, the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt, East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Golan Heights from Syria, all in 6 days.
So the territory under Israeli control basically tripled.
It did. And crucially, as our report underscores, this brought over 1 million Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza under Israeli military occupation. This is the birth of the occupied territories reality that has defined the conflict ever since.
We touched briefly in our report on the lead-up Egypt closing the Straits of Tiran, the UN pulling out peacekeeping forces,
and Israel launching preemptive airstrikes. The military victory was swift and decisive, establishing Israeli dominance in the region.
and afterwards the UN steps in again. Resolution 242.
Yes, passed in November 1967. It called for the withdrawal of Israeli armed forces from territories occupied in the recent conflict and established the principle of land for peace. It's been the bedrock of peace efforts ever since.
But just like Balfour, our analysis points to ambiguity in the language again.
Deliberate ambiguity, yes. Does withdrawal from territories occupied mean all territories or just some territories? That single missing definite article, the territories versus territories, has fueled decades of diplomatic argument. Israel interprets it as allowing for border modifications. Arabs and most of the world interpret it as requiring full withdrawal.
And our report notes the initial Palestinian reaction to 242 wasn't positive either.
No, the PLO rejected it initially because it only referred to Palestinians as a refugee problem. It didn't acknowledge their national rights or their right to self-determination. That came later.
Okay, so the occupation begins in 67, and one of the most visible, most contentious consequences, thoroughly documented in our analysis, is the Israeli settlement movement.
Yes. Our research describes how it started almost immediately after the 67 war and has accelerated dramatically over the decades. We cite the current figures around 700,000 Israeli settlers living in the West Bank and East Jerusalem now.
And crucially, our report highlights the international legal consensus on this.
Right. International bodies, the ICJ, the UN, they've consistently stated these settlements are illegal under international law. Specifically, the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its own civilian population into the territory it occupies.
Israel disputes this applicability, but the international consensus is clear, and our analysis explains why there's such a problem for peace efforts.
They're a massive obstacle. They carve up Palestinian land, making a contiguous, viable future Palestinian state incredibly difficult, if not impossible. They seize vital resources like land and water, and they embed hundreds of thousands of Israelis deep within territory expected to be part of a Palestinian state. It creates enormous physical and political barriers.
So moving on from 67, our report covers the next couple of decades, more conflict, but also the first real peace efforts.
Right. We touch on the 1973 Yom Kippur War, a surprise attack by Egypt and Syria that shook Israel, even though Israel ultimately prevailed militarily. But that shock, our analysis suggests, helped pave the way for a major shift.
Egyptian President Sadat's historic visit to Jerusalem and peace initiative.
Exactly. Which led to the Camp David Accords in 1978, mediated by the U.S. President Carter.
And that resulted in the first peace treaty between Israel and an Arab nation, Egypt.
A landmark achievement. Egypt recognized Israel, got the Sinai Peninsula back. But our analysis notes, the part of the accords dealing with Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza, it never really got implemented.
And our report also mentions the 1982 Lebanon War. Israel invades Lebanon to target the PLO.
Yeah, a really messy, prolonged conflict. The PLO leadership was eventually forced out of Beirut, but Israel ended up occupying southern Lebanon for nearly 2 decades. It showed the conflict spilling over regionally, and again, the limits of purely military solutions.
Okay, all this leads us up to the 1990s and what seemed like a major potential turning point, the Oslo Accords. Our analysis describes these, starting in '93, as a historic breakthrough
They really felt like it at the time, born out of secret talks in Norway, away from the usual spotlight.
and symbolized by that iconic handshake on the White House lawn, Rabin, Arafat, Clinton.
A powerful moment. Our report explains the key outcomes. Israel and the PLO formally recognized each other, and they created a framework for Palestinian interim self-government, the Palestinian Authority, or PA, which would administer parts of the West Bank and Gaza.
The idea was a 5-year transition period, right? Leading to talks on the really tough final status issues, borders, Jerusalem, refugees.
That was the vision. But our analysis digs into why it ultimately failed to deliver a final peace deal. There were significant challenges and limitations right from the start, and things quickly went off track.
What were the main problems our report identified?
A critical one was settlement construction. It didn't stop. In fact, our research found that the settler population in the West Bank and Gaza doubled during the Oslo years, the very years meant to be building towards a Palestinian state.
That seems completely counterintuitive. Negotiating peace while actively changing the facts on the ground.
Exactly. It massively undermined trust. Add to that Palestinian frustration, they got limited self-rule in disconnected areas, but the occupation, the checkpoints, the security restrictions largely continued. Freedom of movement was still heavily curtailed.
And then a devastating blow our analysis highlights: the assassination of Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin.
November 1995. Killed by a right-wing Jewish extremist who opposed Oslo. Rabin was seen as the Israeli leader most committed to and capable of delivering on the accords. His murder was a massive setback.
Our report notes that subsequent Israeli governments seemed less committed to Oslo's original spirit, and Palestinian groups like Hamas, who rejected Oslo from the start, gained influence by opposing it.
Yes, violence from extremists on both sides worked to sabotage the process. It all contributed to this gradual unraveling.
And that failure, that mounting frustration, it explodes into the Second Intifada in September 2000, also called the Al-Aqsa Intifada.
Our analysis indicates it was sparked by Ariel Sharon's visit to the Temple Mount Haram al-Sharif, a very provocative act in Palestinian eyes. But the deeper roots were in the stalled peace process, the dashed hopes of Oslo, and that continued settlement expansion.
And our report distinguishes this intifada from the first one in the late 80s. How was it different?
It was much more violent, more militarized. It featured organized armed attacks, devastating suicide bombings by Palestinian groups targeting Israeli civilians inside cities, and a much harsher, large-scale Israeli military response, including incursions deep into Palestinian cities.
It lasted around 5 years. Huge number of casualties on both sides.
Thousands killed, yes. A really bloody period that shattered much of the remaining hope from Oslo.
And it's during this intifada that Israel starts building the separation barrier. Our research details this.
Began around 2002. Israel's stated reason was security to stop suicide bombers entering Israel from the West Bank. They call it a security fence.
But Palestinians and many international critics have a different name for it.
They call it the apartheid wall. Our report documents the criticism. Its route often goes deep inside the occupied West Bank, not just along the Green Line border. It confiscates Palestinian land, separates farmers from their fields, isolates communities.
And the International Court of Justice weighed in.
Yes, in 2004, the ICJ issued an advisory opinion stating that the barrier's route through occupied territory violated international law. Our analysis presents both sides. Israel points to a significant drop in suicide attacks after it was built. Palestinians point to the immense hardship and restrictions it imposes, calling it a tool of land annexation and control, creating a prison-like environment in some areas.
Okay, moving forward again. Our report covers Israel's unilateral disengagement from Gaza in 2005. What was that about?
This was Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's plan. Israel dismantled all its settlements inside the Gaza Strip, about 21 of them, and withdrew its military forces from within Gaza, ending 38 years of direct military presence on the ground there.
But, and our analysis raises this crucial point, did the occupation of Gaza actually end in 2005?
That's highly debated. Israel withdrew from Gaza, but it maintained control over almost everything going in or out: borders, airspace, coastal waters. So many international bodies and Palestinians argue that effective Israeli control continued, meaning the occupation, in a legal sense, never truly ended. It just changed form. It was also unilateral, not negotiated with the PA.
And this disengagement, happening without a peace agreement, sets the stage for a major political upheaval within Palestinian society.
Absolutely. Our report details Hamas winning the Palestinian legislative elections in January 2006, a shock victory, defeating the long-dominant Fatah party.
How did the world react?
Not well. From Hamas's perspective, our analysis shows the U.S. and EU, key donors, imposed sanctions on the newly formed Hamas-led Palestinian Authority. They demanded Hamas recognize Israel, renounce violence, and accept previous agreements signed by the PLO. Hamas refused.
This creates massive internal tension, right? Between Hamas and Fatah, the party of President Mahmoud Abbas.
Huge tensions, international isolation, financial crisis. It all boiled over. Our report details a brief but brutal internal conflict, almost a civil war, in June 2007. Hamas fighters forcibly seized complete control of the Gaza Strip from Fatah-loyal security forces.
And the result is this geographic and political split that still exists today.
Exactly. Hamas governing Gaza, while the Fatah-led Palestinian Authority governs parts of the West Bank. Two rival Palestinian governments, effectively.
And immediately after Hamas takes over Gaza, Israel and Egypt impose a blockade.
A very strict blockade, largely still in place. Our report presents Israel's justification: security, preventing weapons smuggling and rocket attacks from Hamas and other groups in Gaza. But the humanitarian impact. Our analysis details that extensively.
It's been devastating, hasn't it? Economic collapse, sky-high unemployment consistently over 40%, sometimes much higher. Overwhelming dependence on international aid just for survival. Crumbling infrastructure, water, sanitation, electricity.
Right. And critics, including the UN and numerous human rights groups cited in our report, view the blockade as a form of collective punishment against the entire civilian population of Gaza, which is prohibited under international law.
So this long, difficult history, the occupation, the settlements, the failed peace process, the internal divisions, the Gaza blockade, it all forms the backdrop to the current horrific crisis.
Tragically, yes. Our report describes the unprecedented attack launched by Hamas from Gaza into southern Israel on October 7, 2023.
The scale was shocking. Our analysis documents the numbers. Over 1,200 Israelis killed, mostly civilians. Around 252 people taken hostage back into Gaza.
We highlight the coordinated nature of the assaults, the documented brutality targeting civilians at homes, at a music festival, reports of sexual violence confirmed by UN investigators. Our report notes it was the deadliest single attack on Jews since the Holocaust, a profound trauma for Israelis.
And Israel's response, Operation Iron Sword, is detailed in our report.
Massive aerial bombardment of Gaza, unprecedented in scale, followed by a large-scale ground invasion. The stated goal: destroy Hamas's military capabilities and rescue the hostages.
But the human cost inside Gaza, as our report lays out with data from health authorities and aid agencies, has been absolutely staggering.
Just grim, stark statistics. As of May 2025, Gaza health authorities report over 53,000 Palestinians killed. By September 2024, the UN estimated around 16,500 of those were children. The numbers are contested, especially Hamas combatant figures, but the scale of civilian death is undeniable.
And the displacement.
Nearly the entire population. 2.3 million people forced from their homes, often multiple times, fleeing bombardments, seeking safety that our report indicates simply doesn't exist in much of Gaza.
And that figure you mentioned earlier from May 2025 that our analysis highlights as particularly alarming.
Over 470,000 people facing starvation. That's famine conditions, according to international classifications. 22% of the population. It's shocking. Our report details the near total collapse of the healthcare system, hospitals bombed, non-functional, widespread infrastructure destruction, homes, schools, universities, 625 schools damaged or destroyed, entire neighborhoods just gone.
And the restrictions on aid are a critical factor our findings point to.
Hugely critical. Only a trickle of aid getting in for long periods. Around 30 trucks a day recently compared to 500 trucks before the war, just for basic needs. And that specific detail we included. A complete blockade, no aid allowed in for 11 weeks between March and May 2025. That has catastrophic consequences.
The descriptions cited in our report from UN officials and aid workers are just
apocalyptic. That's the word used. Northern Gaza facing imminent death not just from bombs, but from disease and starvation. It's a humanitarian catastrophe of immense proportions.
Our analysis also covers the significant international legal fallout from this conflict.
Yes. We noted the International Criminal Court, the ICC, issuing arrest warrants in November 2024. That was a major step.
For leaders on both sides, right?
Correct. for Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and then Defense Minister Gallant, and also for Hamas's military commander Mohammed Deif. Charges include war crimes and crimes against humanity. Our report stresses how unprecedented this is for sitting Israeli leaders.
And there's the case at the International Court of Justice, the ICJ.
Right. South Africa brought a case accusing Israel of committing genocide in Gaza. The ICJ issued preliminary orders for Israel to prevent genocide and allow aid, and the full case is ongoing. Plus, numerous UN experts and human rights groups are documenting alleged violations of international humanitarian law by all parties involved.
Our findings suggest these legal actions are increasing Israel's diplomatic isolation.
They definitely appear to be contributing to it, yes.
Okay, shifting gears slightly, but still relevant, our report also touches on broader political changes happening around the conflict, both before and during this latest crisis.
We looked back at the Trump administration's policies before October 7th, like recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital and moving the U.S. embassy there in 2017.
Which broke with decades of U.S. policy and international consensus.
It did. But our report also notes how the U.S. approach seems to be evolving now, in 2025. There's visible public frustration from the Biden administration with Israel's conduct of the war, particularly the humanitarian impact.
And they're pushing harder for ceasefires.
Actively seeking new initiatives. And significantly, our analysis notes engaging directly with Hamas, albeit through intermediaries like Qatar and Egypt, to try and secure hostage releases and ceasefires. That's a shift from past U.S. policy of generally not dealing directly with Hamas, reflecting the extreme urgency of the crisis.
And what about those regional deals, the Abraham Accords?
Right. Starting in 2020, several Arab states, UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, normalized relations with Israel. This was huge because they did it without waiting for a resolution to the Palestinian issue, breaking that old Arab consensus.
How have they held up since the Gaza war started?
Our report notes they've largely held. The diplomatic ties remain. But further expansion, especially getting Saudi Arabia on board, which was a major goal, seems much more complicated now because of the war and regional anger. Though we did note some sources citing Trump administration optimism about potential expansion by 2026 if he returns to office.
What were the pros and cons of those accords, according to our analysis?
Well, the benefits cited were clear. Economic opportunities, security cooperation against shared threats like Iran, technology sharing. But the main criticism, which our report highlights, was that they essentially bypassed the Palestinians, potentially reducing Israel's incentive to make concessions and negotiations for a Palestinian state. They were seen by Palestinians as a betrayal.
Okay, so pulling all this incredibly complex, often tragic history together, along with these recent shifts, our Urban Herald analysis synthesizes it down to the core issues still dividing Israelis and Palestinians today. You mentioned 8 fundamental areas.
Yes. This is where our research really tried to distill the absolute bedrock disagreements. Looking at these makes it crystal clear why peace is so hard to achieve.
Let's quickly run through them based on our findings. First, borders.
Israelis generally want borders based on security needs, meaning keeping major West Bank settlement blocks. Palestinians demand a state based on the 1967 lines, pre-occupation borders, maybe with minor equal land swaps. International law generally backs the 67 lines as the starting point.
Second, Jerusalem.
Israel claims the whole city, including occupied East Jerusalem, as its undivided capital. Palestinians insist East Jerusalem must be the capital of their future state. Again, international law sees East Jerusalem as occupied.
Third, refugees, the Nakba legacy.
Israel says a no mass right of return for Palestinian refugees from 1948 and their descendants into Israel proper, maybe some compensation or return to a future Palestinian state. Palestinians insist on the right of return, citing UN Resolution 194. International law supports principles like voluntary return or compensation.
Fourth, security.
Israel demands arrangements to ensure its security, potentially including a long-term military presence in the West Bank and a demilitarized Palestinian state. Palestinians demand an end to the occupation and sovereignty over their own security, possibly with international guarantees. International law requires security measures to be proportionate and respect civilian rights.
Fifth, settlements. We talked about this.
Israel continues settlement activity, often citing natural growth. Palestinians demand a complete halt and removal of all settlements. International law, as we said, deems them illegal.
Sixth, water resources. Often overlooked, but vital.
Israel currently controls the majority of shared water resources, especially the West Bank aquifers. Palestinians demand a fair, equitable share. International water law supports equitable sharing.
Seventh, the status of Gaza.
Israel maintains the blockade, citing security needs related to Hamas. Palestinians demand it be lifted entirely, calling it illegal collective punishment. International law prohibits collective punishment.
And finally, eighth, mutual recognition. Seems simple, but isn't.
Israel demands Palestinian recognition of Israel as a specifically Jewish state. Palestinians are willing to recognize the State of Israel, but resist the Jewish state definition, fearing it prejudices the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel and the refugee issue. They demand Israeli recognition of a sovereign Palestinian state and an end to occupation. International law supports self-determination for both peoples.
Wow. Okay, laying them out like that. Our report really shows the sheer depth of the chasm on every single core issue.
It really does. It illustrates why decades of negotiations have ultimately failed to bridge these fundamental gaps.
And our analysis is pretty clear on why the main proposed solution, the two-state solution, looks increasingly shaky, isn't it?
Very clear. We point directly to the settlements, 700,000 settlers creating these massive physical and political barriers. They fragment Palestinian territory so much that a viable contiguous state looks incredibly difficult to achieve now. Our report even notes some analysts arguing a one-state reality of unequal rights under Israeli control is already here.
Other obstacles, too.
Internal Palestinian divisions are huge. Hamas controlling Gaza, the PA, with limited authority in the West Bank, who can negotiate for and implement a deal for all Palestinians. Plus, our analysis identifies a clear shift rightward in Israeli politics over the years, meaning less public and political appetite for the major territorial compromises needed for two states.
We briefly touch on alternatives in the report, like confederation.
Mentioned, yes, but our research indicates they lack broad support from either side right now. And importantly, our report stresses that ideas floated about forcibly displacing Palestinians again, those have been universally condemned and rejected.
Our analysis really uses this current Gaza crisis as a stark example, doesn't it? Showing the failure of purely military approaches.
Absolutely. It brutally highlights the limits of trying to manage the conflict militarily without addressing the underlying political issues. It underscores the desperate need for actual sustainable political solutions. We also note how religious and political extremism on both sides consistently undermines moderates and any chance for compromise.
So after laying out all this complexity and tragedy, how does the Urban Herald team conclude this analysis? What's the takeaway on understanding this maybe moving forward?
Our conclusion really circles back to that immense complexity. It's over a century of competing claims, narratives shaped by trauma, deep grievances on both sides. We emphasize that both peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, have legitimate aspirations for security, for dignity, for self-determination in their homeland. Any workable solution has to acknowledge and somehow address the core needs of both.
And the human cost is central to our conclusion.
Paramount. The generations of suffering, the cycles of violence, the displacement, the lost lives, the lost potential. Our report frames this immense human toll as creating an urgent moral imperative to find a way out, however hard it looks.
What does our analysis suggest about the path forward, realistically?
It's about balancing things that seem almost impossible to balance. Historical justice claims with present-day realities on the ground, demographics, security needs, international law. We highlight the critical need for education that promotes understanding, not hatred, for dialogue even when it's painful, and for courageous leadership on both sides willing to make compromises for peace.
What about the international community's role?
Important, yes. Providing aid, supporting development, helping build confidence, upholding international law. But our report concludes that ultimately, sustainable peace depends on Israelis and Palestinians themselves. They are the ones who have to make the incredibly difficult compromises, accept shared responsibility, and find a way to live together or side by side.
Our research process really hammered home the need for objective analysis, didn't it? Trying to engage with all perspectives, using nuance, trying to find empathy, even when talking about horrific events.
Definitely. Which brings us right back full circle to where we started, the current nightmare unfolding in Gaza.
Exactly. Our report uses it as this stark, undeniable reminder. The cost of not finding a political resolution, the cost of inaction, is measured in the most awful way possible. Human lives, shattered communities, lost futures.
And the Urban Herald's analysis ends on a thought that really stayed with our whole team. It's about the moral imperative for peace, for breaking this cycle. It's never been clearer. And, despite how impossible it all seems right now, history does sometimes offer these glimmers of hope. Resolution can happen when somehow humanity, justice, and hope manage to prevail over generations of fear and hatred.
It's a heavy thought to end on, isn't it? Maybe the toughest question our analysis leaves you, the listener, with isn't even what a solution looks like on paper. We've laid out
Oh.
the issues. But it's whether leaders and populations on both sides, so deeply scarred by generations of trauma and loss, can ever actually make the compromises needed. And what role can outside understanding or pressure realistically play in helping them get there?
A question we all need to keep grappling with.
Thank you for joining us for this Urban Herald deep dive into the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, based on the comprehensive analysis our team put together for you. We really hope it provides some valuable context for understanding the immense challenges and the profound human tragedy unfolding today.